Imagine standing in the middle of a snow-covered forest, your breath rising in clouds, the world a canvas of white and shadow. Now imagine moving through it and becoming invisible. Not by magic, not by modern camouflage, but through techniques perfected centuries ago by native hunters. They didn't need synthetic fabrics or high-tech ghillie suits. They became part of the winter itself, unseen and unheard, their presence only known to those who understood the land as intimately as they did. Across the frozen plains and dense woodlands, hunters learned to break their outlines against snowdrifts, shadows, and patches of vegetation. Animal hides, furs, and feathers were selected not just for warmth, but for the subtle patterns that mimicked the local terrain. Ash, mud, and natural dyes added texture and depth, disrupting the shape of the human form. In some regions, a snowshoe hare cloak could blend perfectly with drifting snow. In others, a wolf pelt hid a figure amid darkened evergreen groves. Every choice was deliberate, every detail informed by observation and experience. But it wasn't just the clothing. It was the movement. Hunters read the wind, stepped silently, paused for the right moment, and became part of the rhythm of the forest. Snow that crunched for an outsider was silenced by careful steps, and shadows became allies in hiding. They understood that survival depended not only on what you wore, but on how you behaved, how you breathed, and how you waited. This ancient mastery of disappearance kept communities safe, fed families, and allowed hunters to thrive in conditions that would overwhelm the unprepared. Today, these techniques remain a testament to ingenuity, patience, and deep observation. Subscribe now and follow us as we reveal the secrets of disappearing into the cold, showing how the lessons of the past still guide the modern outdoorsman, photographer, and survivalist. Winter looks simple from a distance: white ground, dark trees, and sharp shadows. But to the native hunters who moved through it, the cold season was a complex stage where every color, texture, and sound mattered. Camouflage began long before clothing or tools came into play. It started with reading the landscape itself. Snow wasn't just snow. Fresh powder reflected light differently than wind-packed drifts. Wet, heavy snow darkened around tree trunks, while ice-coated surfaces glared like polished stone. Hunters memorized these shades and patterns, knowing exactly where their bodies would stand out and where they could disappear with ease. A ridge blown clean by the wind required a different approach than a valley filled with knee-deep powder. Every terrain demanded its own strategy. Light shifted constantly. Morning glare created blinding reflections. Dusk stretched shadows across the ground like long fingers. Hunters learned to use those shadows as cover, slipping between them as if moving through doorways. On cloudy days, the brightness dulled and colors flattened, which meant clothing and movement needed to be more subtle. Even overcast skies had a pattern, a faint blue tint that could give away the wrong shade of hide or cloth. Sound was another layer of the winter canvas. Snow could be silent or treacherously loud. Dry, cold flakes squeaked underfoot, while warmer snow crunched with every step. Hunters listened before moving, waiting for wind gusts, tree falls, or the distant call of an animal to mask their sound. Silence wasn't the absence of noise. It was the timing between it. Regional differences shaped everything. The Great Plains demanded broad, wind-cut silhouettes. The northern woodlands offered dense cover and broken shadows. Farther north, the tundra left no hiding spots at all, so the camouflage had to be perfect. To disappear in winter, you didn't fight the environment. You learned how it behaved until it stopped noticing you. Before a hunter ever stepped into the snow, the work of disappearing began in the hands of the makers. Winter camouflage wasn't thrown together. It was crafted, layer by layer, using materials chosen with absolute purpose. Every hide, every thread of sinew, every smear of ash had a job to do. Animal skins were the foundation. Hunters selected furs that matched the terrain at its coldest: the white coat of the snowshoe hare, the mottled winter pelt of a deer, the thick gray of a wolf. These weren't chosen for aesthetics. They were chosen because the animals themselves had already mastered the art of not being seen. Wearing their patterns wasn't imitation. It was strategy. But the clothing didn't rely on fur alone. Ash from dried wood was rubbed into seams and exposed skin to dull shine. Mud from riverbanks was mixed into pastes that darkened outlines around joints and hands. Birch bark, scraped thin, was sometimes tied onto clothing to mimic patches of snow-covered trunks. Each detail broke apart the smooth human silhouette, turning a solid figure into shifting textures that blended with the land. Some disguises were astonishingly deliberate. A hunter dressed in the white pelt of a hare could move across open snow with almost no contrast. A wolfskin draped over shoulders allowed someone to approach prey or rival predators without raising alarm. In deep forests, feathers from owls or grouse were stitched into hoods, creating soft edges that merged with branches and undergrowth. The craftsmanship didn't stop with clothing. Snowshoes were laced with patterns that left prints resembling animal tracks rather than human ones. Even the tools were considered. Wooden spear shafts rubbed with soot to prevent reflection. Bowstrings coated with fine clay to avoid catching the light. Nothing about this camouflage was accidental. Every fiber, every shade, every layer was selected to solve a single problem: how to move through the winter world without disturbing it. Camouflage didn't end with clothing. In winter, the difference between being seen and staying hidden often came down to the way a hunter moved, or chose not to move at all. Native hunters understood that snow wasn't just a surface, it was an amplifier. Every step, every shift of weight, every exhale carried farther in the cold. So they learned to move like the landscape: slow, patient, and deliberate. A hunter didn't stride across snow. He glided. Knees bent, weight balanced, steps placed on the outer edge of the foot first to test the sound before committing. Each movement matched the tempo of the world around him. Wind through trees, falling snow, the distant creak of ice. If the environment paused, he paused too. If a gust swept across the ridge, he took a step. Timing replaced speed. Awareness guided every decision. Hunters tracked the direction of the wind so scent drifted away from their goal. They read the shadows cast by branches and shaped their path through those dark corridors, where outlines dissolved. In deep woods, they used trees as shields, shifting only when their profile aligned with a trunk or drift. On open plains, they crouched low and let the horizon swallow their shape. Stillness was a weapon. A hunter could hold a position for minutes, even hours, waiting for the precise moment when prey turned its head or a storm muffled all sound. In that silence, breathing slowed until each exhale blended with the cold air, fading into nothing. But movement wasn't just physical, it was mental. Disappearing required patience, control, and the ability to let the world lead instead of trying to dominate it. Hunters didn't rush, they merged. They didn't chase shadows, they became part of them. And in that union of technique and mindset, a person stopped being a figure in the snow and became a ghost in the winter. Winter wasn't the same everywhere, and neither was the art of disappearing. Camouflage shifted dramatically from region to region because the land itself demanded different strategies. What worked on the open plains would fail instantly in dense northern forests, and what blended into Arctic tundra would stand out like a flame in mountain snow. Native hunters didn't use a single method. They created a new one for every environment they entered. On the Great Plains, the world turned into a wide, blinding sheet of snow with nowhere to hide. Hunters relied on distance, low profiles, and long shadows. White buffalo robes and hareskin cloaks helped them merge with open terrain, while their movements stayed close to the ground. Tracks were a giveaway on flat land, so snowshoes were often shaped to resemble animal prints, misleading anyone or anything following behind. In the northern woodlands, camouflage became more textured. Snow clung to tree bark in patches, branches sagged under frost, and shadows broke the landscape into fragmented shapes. Hunters mimicked this complexity with layered hides, feather-lined hoods, and strips of bark tied to arms and legs to break up outlines. Clothing shifted from pure white to mottled patterns that matched the stripped branches and dim winter light. The forest didn't hide people automatically. It required them to mimic its broken geometry. Farther north, in the Arctic and subarctic, camouflage reached its most extreme form. With no trees, no rocks, and nothing but white and wind, visibility became a brutal test. Hunters wore caribou skins with hollow fur that matched both color and texture of the tundra. Snowblocks were used not only for shelter, but also as visual cover, creating temporary blinds that blended perfectly into the landscape. Even tools were wrapped in pale hides to prevent dark shapes from giving away a position. Each region shaped its own techniques, materials, and tactics. The land dictated the rules, and native hunters adjusted with precision, proving that true camouflage is never a one-size-fits-all skill, but a conversation with the environment itself. Clothing alone didn't make someone disappear in winter. The real mastery came from modifying the body's appearance using simple, powerful materials drawn straight from the landscape. Native hunters knew that breaking up the human silhouette required more than fur and hide. It required texture, disruption, and clever use of contrast. Ash was one of the most effective tools. The fine gray powder dulled reflections on skin, hair, and clothing, ensuring that a stray glimmer of light wouldn't betray a hidden position. Rubbing ash along the cheeks and forehead softened the contours of the face, making it harder to distinguish from snowbanks and tree trunks. When mixed with animal fat, ash could be applied in thin, controlled streaks, perfect for mimicking the shadowy patterns found in winter forests. Natural dyes offered another layer of disguise. Crushed berries produced soft blues and purples that matched shaded snow. Clay produced pale tans that blended into dried winter grass. Charcoal, used sparingly, added depth to areas where hunters needed to echo the darker lines of branches or rocky outcroppings. None of these dyes were used for decoration. They were pure function, tuned with the same precision as a hunter's tools. Snow itself became a material. Hunters packed it onto clothing or rubbed it across sleeves and shoulders to create irregular patches of white. This wasn't about covering the entire body, just breaking the outline enough that the eye failed to recognize a human shape. Snow clung to fur naturally, making it an effortless, ever-changing camouflage layer that adjusted with movement. Even the breath could be managed. Hunters would exhale into sleeves or scarves to reduce the plume that could give away a hiding place in cold air. Small details like these separated an amateur attempt from true invisibility. These simple materials weren't random choices. They were calculated solutions. With ash, dyes, clay, and snow, native hunters sculpted their appearance until they were no longer a figure in the landscape, but part of its shifting patterns. Some of the most astonishing cold-weather camouflage wasn't just blending into the scenery. It was becoming another living presence within it. Native hunters learned early that the easiest way to vanish in winter was to borrow the identity of the animals who already excelled at it. The result was a level of disguise that seemed impossible to outsiders. A human who moved like a shadow, dressed like the land, and appeared, at a distance, to be an entirely different creature. One of the most effective disguises came from the snowshoe hare. Its winter coat turned pure white, matching new snow almost perfectly. Hunters crafted cloaks from these pelts, stitching them so tightly that each piece appeared seamless. When worn in open terrain, these garments erased the human outline completely. A person crouched low became nothing more than another pale shape on the ground, a lump of wind-blown snow, invisible until the moment of action. Wolf disguises offered another advantage. By draping a wolf pelt over the shoulders and shaping the hood to mirror the animal's profile, a hunter could approach prey that would normally flee at the sight of a human. The key wasn't just the look, it was the movement. The wearer learned to step with long, gliding motions, pausing with the stillness of a predator. Herd animals reacted to shape and behavior, not just scent, and a silhouette that hinted wolf instead of man gave the hunter precious seconds to close the distance. In dense forests, mimicry took a different form. Hunters tied feathers from owls or grouse into their hoods and sleeves. These soft, irregular edges broke up the straight lines of the human body, making the figure melt into the surrounding thickets. Birch bark panels were sometimes strapped to arms and legs to echo the patchy vertical strips that marked winter trees. These disguises weren't costumes. They were tools, crafted with patience, worn with intention, and perfected by practice. They allowed a person to move through winter as something other than human. Not to deceive for sport, but to survive in a season where every advantage mattered. Ready for Section 7. Silence. In winter, sound behaves differently. Cold air sharpens every noise, turning a snapped twig into an echo, and a misplaced step into a signal that carries far beyond the trees. Native hunters understood this better than anyone. Camouflage didn't work unless movement matched the season, and winter demanded a science of silence. The first rule was simple: follow the wind, never fight it. Hunters positioned themselves so the breeze carried sound and scent away from their target. Even the subtlest shift mattered. A gust that bent a pine branch created the perfect moment to move. A sudden lull called for absolute stillness. Reading the wind became as essential as tracking prints in the snow. Footwork transformed into an art form. Snow wasn't just a surface, it was a language. Powder whispered, crust cracked, and wet snow groaned under pressure. Each type required its own technique. In deep drifts, hunters stepped straight down, lifting the foot gently to avoid collapse at the edges. On hard-packed ground, they rolled the foot from outer edge to heel to reduce squeaking. When moving across crusted ice, they slid rather than lifted, letting the ground carry some of the motion. Breathing even became strategic. In freezing temperatures, a cloud of warm air could expose a hidden position. Hunters exhaled downward into scarves or sleeves, scattering the vapor before it rose. In exposed areas with no wind cover, breaths were held during critical steps, or released in thin, controlled layers to avoid detection. Timing completed the system. Hunters synchronized their movements with natural sounds. Cracking branches, animal calls, distant avalanches, or the drum of falling snow. They didn't overpower the landscape. They inserted themselves into it, moving when it moved, freezing when it froze. The result was astonishing to anyone unfamiliar with these methods. A hunter who could pass within yards of an animal or an enemy without being seen, heard, or even sensed. Winter rewarded those who listened first and acted second. In winter, the ground becomes a diary. Every footprint, drag mark, and crushed patch of snow tells a story. And in a world where survival depended on not being followed, native hunters mastered the art of erasing their presence, long before modern leave-no-trace ideas existed. Snow wasn't an obstacle. It was a surface to outthink. The first lesson was understanding how snow records movement. Fresh powder showed details sharply. Heel marks, weight shifts, even the shape of toes through thin moccasins. Packed snow, on the other hand, left softer impressions that could linger for days. Hunters learned to read these clues so well that they could tell a traveler's pace, burden, and intention just from a few prints. And by knowing how to read them, they knew exactly how to hide their own. To disguise footprints, different strategies were used depending on region and snow conditions. In deep winter, hunters stepped in existing animal trails, following paths made by deer, wolves, or hare, so their footprints blended with the natural traffic of the forest. On wide plains, snowshoes were crafted with patterns that mimicked animal tracks. A human crossing a ridge might leave prints that looked more like a wandering deer than a person. In places where the snow was soft and revealing, hunters walked backwards to confuse anyone tracking them, then veered off the trail silently, using branches or hide-wrapped poles to brush over their original steps. Fresh powder made this easier. A few sweeps erased everything. Even clothing minimized trace. Long cloaks brushed behind as the wearer walked, smoothing footprints just enough to distort them. In dense woods, hunters used fallen branches to lightly sweep the ground as they moved, blending each print into the forest floor. The goal wasn't to vanish completely, just to become impossible to follow. By breaking the pattern of human movement, disguising shape, and using the land's own marks as cover, they created trails that led nowhere. Or, better yet, looked like no one had passed at all. To survive winter unseen, it wasn't enough to disappear in the moment. You had to disappear from history itself.